I've spent 40 years with metal shavings in my boots and machine oil under my fingernails. And not once in all that time did I think I'd end up in handcuffs on my own shop floor. But there I was, on a gray Tuesday morning in March, standing between the lathe I bought, used in 1994, and the drill press I taught my son to run when he was 14 years old, while two Springfield police officers read me my rights in front of 22 people who'd worked for me for years. Deb, my office manager, had her hand over her mouth. Ronnie, my best machinist, wouldn't look at me at all. And my son, my own son, stood by the loading dock with his arms crossed, wearing an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was 17 and got caught lying about a dented fender. He didn't look scared. He didn't look confused. He looked like a man watching a plan come together. They cuffed my hands behind my back and walked me past the machines I'd built this company on, past the wall where I'd hung a photograph of my wife, Maggie, cutting the ribbon the day we moved into this building in 1998. And as they put me in the back of that patrol car, my son leaned down to the window and said 4 words I will never forget as long as I live. "You should have just signed." He had no idea what I'd already set in motion. He had no idea what his own mother had done 18 months before she died, standing in a lawyer's office 2 counties over, quietly making sure that whatever happened to me after she was gone, I would never face it with empty hands. 10 days later, he was the one begging. But before I tell you what happened at that shop, I need to tell you how a boy I once paid $2 an hour to sweep floors, and a woman I loved for 41 years, ended up being the reason I'm not in a cell right now. Welcome back to Dad's Revenge Stories. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to us. I am Walt Brandgain, and this channel is where fathers tell the truth about what family really costs and what it means to stand your ground when the people who owe you the most turn out to owe you nothing at all. Before I go on, do me a favor. Drop the name of your city or your state in the comments below, so I can see just how far this story has traveled by the time it's over. It means more than you'd think, hearing where you're all listening from. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. Not on that shop floor. 40 years before it, I was 26 years old when I signed the lease on a cinder block garage on Selma Road, with $3,000 I'd borrowed from my father-in-law, and a second-hand Bridgeport milling machine that still had somebody else's initials scratched into the base. I didn't have a business degree. I had steady hands, a mind for tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, and a wife named Margaret who believed in me more than I believed in myself. Everybody called her Maggie. She taught 2nd grade at Snyder Park Elementary for 31 years, and she used to say that raising 8-year-olds and running a machine shop weren't so different. Both jobs were about patience and about showing up again the next day no matter how the last one went. We built Bishop Precision Machine Company one contract at a time. First, it was small parts for a farm equipment supplier out of Urbana. Then, in 1991, we landed our first subcontract for a supplier working with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, precision components with tolerances so tight that if you breathed wrong on the micrometer, you'd fail inspection. That contract put us on the map. By the time we moved into the building on Titus Road in 1998, we had 11 employees and a waiting list of customers. Maggie cut the ribbon that day with a pair of tin snips because we couldn't find real scissors. She laughed so hard she had to lean on my arm. That's the photograph that hung on my office wall, The one they walked me past in handcuffs 26 years later. We had one son, Bradley. Brad, to everybody but his mother, who never stopped calling him Bradley his whole life, even when he was 38 years old, with a receding hairline and a mortgage. He grew up in that shop the way some kids grow up in a church, sweeping floors at 12, running the drill press at 14, supervised close because I wasn't about to let my boy lose a finger to save 5 minutes. By 19, he could read a blueprint better than half my journeyman. I remember the first time I let him run a part completely on his own. No supervision, start to finish. He was 16. A batch of aluminum brackets for a farm implement customer. Nothing that would end the world if he scrapped a few. He ruined the first 3, and I watched him from my office, waiting to see whether he'd come get me or try to figure out what he'd done wrong on his own. He figured it out. Took him 40 minutes, but he found the problem in his feed rate, adjusted it himself, and ran the rest of that batch clean. I never told him I'd been watching. I just told Maggie that night I thought the boy had it in him. She used to say the same thing about her second graders, that you could tell early which kids would fight through a hard math problem and which ones would wait for somebody to hand them the answer. She always said Brad was a fighter. I believed her for 38 years. I still don't know exactly when that stopped being true, or whether it ever really was, or whether somewhere along the way he just got tired of fighting for things the hard way when there turned out to be an easier one. I always figured he'd take the place over one day. I just never thought about what one day would actually feel like when it came. Maggie got sick in the spring, 3 years ago now. Pancreatic cancer. The kind of diagnosis where the doctor's face tells you the number before his mouth does. She fought it for 14 months, with a grace that still humbles me to think about. She kept grading spelling tests for the neighbor kids she used to tutor right up until she physically couldn't hold a pen anymore. She died on a Tuesday in October in the bedroom of the house we'd lived in for 30 years, with my hand in hers. I won't pretend the shop mattered to me in the weeks after that. Nothing mattered. Deb ran the office. Ronnie ran the floor. I sat in my recliner and looked at a woman's garden going to seed in October frost. And I let it go to seed because I couldn't make myself care about tomato plants when the person who planted them was gone. That's when Brad and his wife Vanessa moved into the guest house behind ours, out on Yellow Springs Road. Brad said he wanted to help me through it, said it was the least he could do. I believed him completely. That was my first mistake, and it wouldn't be my last. For the first few months, Brad's help looked exactly like what a grieving father needs. He'd sit with me at the kitchen table some nights and we'd talk about nothing. Football, the weather, whether the Reds had any pitching left. He started coming into the shop 3, then 4 days a week, sitting in on meetings with Deb, learning the accounts payable side of things. I handed him more of the bookkeeping than I probably should have, but grief makes you generous with trust in ways you don't examine too closely at the time. By the following spring, Brad was running payroll, vendor payments, and the relationship with our bank. I still signed the big checks. Anything over $10,000 needed my signature, a rule I'd had since 1995 after a bookkeeper years back tried to skim from us. But everything under that ran through him. The first thing that didn't sit right with me was small. In February, I noticed we'd switched steel suppliers from Cardinal Metals in Dayton, who we'd used for 18 years, to some outfit out of Cincinnati I'd never heard of called Buckeye Alloy Supply. When I asked Brad about it, he said Buckeye was cheaper. I checked the invoices later. They weren't cheaper. They were about 4% more expensive, and the material certs, the paperwork proving the steel met aerospace-grade specifications, were thinner than what Cardinal used to send, sloppier. I mentioned it to Deb. She said Brad told her it was a relationship thing. that Buckeye's owner was a friend of Curtis's. Deb had worked the front office for 26 years by then, since before Brad could tie his own shoes, and she had a way of saying things without quite saying them. She caught me in the parking lot a few days later, on her way out to her car, and said, "Walt, I've been keeping these books a long time. I'm not going to tell you how to run your own family, but you might want to look a little closer at who's approving what these days." "Closer how?" I asked. She shrugged, the careful shrug of a woman who'd said as much as she was willing to say out loud. "Just closer." She said, and got in her car. I told myself Deb was just being protective, the way she'd always been protective of this place, the way she'd once flagged a bookkeeper skimming petty cash back in 2003 before anybody else noticed. I didn't push her further that day. I wish now I had, but grief has a way of making you slow to hear warnings, even from people who've earned the right to be believed the first time. Curtis Voss was Vanessa's older brother. I'd met him maybe 6 times in 4 years, always at a holiday dinner or a birthday party, always with a new business idea he was excited about and never quite explained the specifics of. Real estate flips mostly. Lake properties. He had the kind of confident, backslapping charm that made you want to trust him, and the kind of squint in his eyes that made you regret it 30 seconds later. Maggie never liked him. She'd say, that man could sell ice to a penguin and convince it the ice was doing him a favor. I let the steel supplier thing go. It was 4%. It wasn't worth a fight with my grieving son over 4% on raw material costs, not when I still couldn't walk past the garden without my chest going tight. But 4% was never really about steel. Vanessa had been part of our family for 4 years by then, and if you'd asked me to describe her before all this happened, I would have said she was ambitious, polished. She'd built a modest following online doing wellness coaching, green smoothies, morning routines, that sort of thing. And she had a way of talking about manifesting abundance that made Maggie roll her eyes so hard I worried she'd strain something. But Vanessa was never cruel to my face. She brought me casseroles after Maggie died. She asked about my blood pressure. She sat with me on the porch some evenings and let me talk about Maggie without changing the subject, which is a rarer kindness than people realize. Still, there were things. In April, she started asking questions that seemed innocent on their own, but added up strangely together. What was the shop's land actually worth? Whether I'd ever had it appraised since the highway department announced they were upgrading the Route 68 interchange 2 miles from our building. Whether I'd thought about what would happen to all this if something happened to me, the way it happened to Maggie, sudden and impossible to plan around. "You should really talk to an estate attorney, Walt," she told me one evening in May, refilling my iced tea without being asked, "just so everything's protected, for Brad's sake." I said I'd think about it. I meant it too. I just didn't think about it the way she wanted me to. Then in June, I walked into what used to be Maggie's sewing room, the room Brad and Vanessa had started using as a home office since they didn't have their own space yet in the guest house, and found Vanessa standing in the middle of it with her arms out slightly, turning in a slow circle, looking at the walls the way you look at a room you're planning to redecorate, measuring it with her eyes. She didn't hear me in the doorway. When she finally noticed me, she smiled fast and said she was thinking about hanging some art in there. I nodded and walked away, but something in my chest had gone cold that had nothing to do with June heat. A few weeks later, we had a small backyard cookout for the 4th of July. Nothing big, just Brad and Vanessa, Ruth from across the street, and Curtis, who'd driven up from Cincinnati for the weekend. I was at the grill when I overheard Curtis talking to Brad by the fence, the two of them a little loose from a couple of beers, not realizing how far sound carries in a quiet backyard at dusk. Once the interchange upgrade goes through, Curtis was saying, that land's worth triple what it is now. Maybe more, depending on who's buying. You'd be crazy not to at least get it appraised. It's not mine to appraise, Brad said, and there was something in his voice. Not quite an objection, more like a man repeating a rule out loud to remind himself it still applied. Not yet, Curtis said, and laughed and clinked his bottle against Brad's like he'd made a joke. I stood at that grill with a spatula in my hand and a burger going overdone on the flame, and I told myself it was just talk. Two guys with a few beers in them, dreaming about money that wasn't theirs. I flipped the burger, called everyone over for dinner, and didn't say a word about what I'd heard. Looking back now, I think that cookout was the exact moment the whole thing stopped being a feeling I couldn't quite name and started being something I simply refused to look at directly, because looking at it meant admitting what kind of a man my son might be turning into. Late July. I stayed at the shop past 6 one evening to finish inspecting a batch of parts for a customer audit, and I ended up in the back office where Brad kept his laptop charging on the desk we shared. The screen had gone to sleep, but when I bumped the desk, it woke up on an email he'd forgotten to close. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't snooping. I was reaching for a stapler, but once I saw the subject line, balloon payment, Indian Lake property, urgent, I couldn't make myself look away. The email was from a lending group called Miami Valley Capital Partners. It referenced a loan balance of $1,850,000 secured against a property near Indian Lake that Brad and Curtis had bought 2 years earlier to flip. The email said the balloon payment, the whole amount, all at once, was due in 90 days, and that if it wasn't paid, the lender would exercise its rights against the personal guarantees on file. Both names were on that guarantee, Bradley Bishop, Curtis Foss. I sat down in my son's chair and read that email 4 times. My hands weren't steady on the mouse. $1,850,000. My son owed almost $2 million on a lake house flip that had apparently fallen apart, and he had never once mentioned it to me. Not over dinner, not on the porch, not in any of the quiet evenings we'd spent together since his mother died, when I thought we were finally getting closer instead of further apart. I closed the laptop and drove home in silence, and I didn't say a word to Brad about it that night, or the next, or the one after that. I told myself I was giving him a chance to come to me on his own. The truth is, some part of me, the part that had built a company from a cinder block garage with nothing but sweat and stubbornness, already understood what a desperate man with a 90-day clock and access to his father's shop might eventually decide to do. In the weeks after I found that email, I made a few quiet calls of my own, not to Brad, not yet, but to our banker at Third Federal, a man I'd known for 2 decades, asking careful, roundabout questions about whether he'd heard anything about trouble with the Indian Lake property Curtis had been developing. He hadn't heard specifics, but he mentioned, almost in passing, that Curtis had come in asking about a business loan against family assets back in the spring and been turned down flat. That was the moment the whole shape of it started to feel less like a private family matter and more like something with a clock already running on it. I just never imagined he'd decide to do it to me. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in March, 8 months after I'd found that email. I'd been quietly asking around by then. A call to our bank, a careful conversation with our insurance agent about the shop's property value. But I hadn't confronted Brad yet. I kept telling myself I needed more before I said anything. I didn't want to be wrong about my own son. That morning started ordinary. Coffee at 5:30, same as it had been for 40 years. I drove to the shop, walked the floor the way I always did, said good morning to Ronnie at the lathe and to the 2 new apprentices we'd hired in January. Around 10 o'clock, Vanessa came by the shop, which wasn't unusual by then. She'd taken to helping with the books alongside Brad most weeks, and asked if I'd come down to the tool crib in the basement to help her find some archived customer files. I want you to understand something about that basement stairwell. I built the handrail on it myself in 2003. I know every one of those 14 concrete steps the way I know my own hands. We were maybe 4 steps down when Vanessa let out a scream that stopped my heart, and by the time I turned around, she was already falling down at the bottom of the stairs, one leg twisted underneath her, screaming that I'd grabbed her arm, that I'd pushed her. I hadn't touched her. I want to say that plainly, because it matters. I was 3 steps above her, and I hadn't laid a hand on that woman. Ronnie heard the scream and came running. Somebody called 911. By the time the paramedics arrived, Vanessa was performing pain with the kind of precision I'd only ever seen in movies, moaning, clutching her back, gasping when anyone got near her left side, and Brad arrived from the parking lot within about 90 seconds, which struck me as strange even in the chaos of the moment, because he'd told Deb that morning he was running late from an appointment in Dayton, 40 minutes away. I remember strange details from those first few minutes with a clarity that still surprises me. The smell of cutting oil in the basement air, the particular echo the stairwell always had, the one I used to complain about when we ran the shop radio down there. Ronnie's face, white as a shop rag, saying my name over and over like he was trying to wake me up from something. Deb standing at the top of the stairs with both hands pressed over her mouth, not saying anything at all. The paramedics moved Vanessa onto a backboard with the kind of careful, practiced motion that made the whole scene feel more real than it had any right to, and by the time the first patrol car pulled into our lot, most of the floor had gathered near the break room door, machines still running behind them, nobody quite willing to shut down a job mid-cycle even with everything falling apart 6 feet away. The police showed up 11 minutes later. A young officer named Kowalski took statements. Vanessa, from her gurney, told him through tears that I had grabbed her arm during an argument about signing some paperwork and shoved her down the stairs. I stood on my own shop floor, in front of Deb and Ronnie and every machinist who'd clocked in that morning, and I watched 2 officers walk toward me with the unhurried certainty of men who already believed they knew exactly how this story ended. They cuffed my hands behind my back. They read me my rights, and as they walked me toward the patrol car, past the lathe, past the drill press, past the photograph of Maggie cutting a ribbon with tin snips, my son leaned in close enough that only I could hear him. "You should have just signed," he said. 40 years. 40 years I'd spent building something with my own 2 hands, and my son's first instinct, watching me get handcuffed in front of everyone who worked for me, was satisfaction that his plan was working. I didn't say anything back. I didn't have anything to say yet. But something in me went very still and very clear in that moment, the particular stillness of a man who has just understood, completely and without doubt, exactly what he's dealing with. The Clark County Jail smelled like bleach and old coffee, and I sat in a holding cell for 6 hours before anyone came to see me. When they finally let me make a call, I didn't call Brad. I called Pete Ridgway, an old friend who ran a supplier shop 2 towns over, a man I'd known since 1989, back when we were both still cutting our own material on manual mills. Pete didn't ask me a single question about whether I did it. He just said, I'm calling Denise Okafor. Sit tight. Denise Okafor ran a small criminal defense practice out of a converted storefront on Fountain Avenue downtown, and her name meant something in Clark County. She defended a supplier of mine years back against a bogus workers' comp claim, and won in about a third of the time anybody expected. She showed up at the jail before dinner that same evening, sharp-eyed, unhurried, carrying a legal pad instead of a briefcase. "Mr. Bishop," she said, sitting across from me in a room that smelled like burnt coffee, "I want you to tell me everything. Start from before this morning. The details you think don't matter are usually the ones that matter most." So I told her. The steel supplier switch, the email about the balloon payment, Vanessa measuring Maggie's sewing room like she already owned it, the stairwell, the scream, the 90 seconds it took Brad to arrive from a 40-minute appointment. Denise wrote for a long time without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down. "Here's what I need you to understand," she said. "Right now, this looks like your word against your daughter-in-law's, with a police report that already leans against you. That's not a conviction, but it's not nothing either. We're going to need more than your account of what happened on those stairs." "What kind of more?" I asked. "Cameras," she said. "Financial records. Anything that shows a motive beyond a family argument. And Mr. Bishop?" She looked at me directly over the top of her glasses. "I want you to think very hard about whether there's anything in that shop or in your home that might have recorded more than your son wants you to know about." I thought about the security system I'd installed in the shop 6 years ago, after somebody walked off with $2,000 in carbide tooling, and I thought, for the first time in 8 hours, about whether Brad had known that system existed when he decided to bring his wife down those particular stairs. Real quick, if this story's got you invested already, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. I've got a lot more of these to tell, and I don't want you missing the next one. All right. Back to it. The arraignment happened the next morning. In a Clark County courtroom I'd walked past 100 times without ever imagining I'd stand inside it as a defendant. Denise argued for bond on the grounds that I had no prior record in 66 years of living in that county, that I owned a business employing 22 people who depended on me showing up to work, and that I posed no risk of fleeing a town I'd lived in my entire adult life. The judge, a heavy-set man named Halloran, who I recognized vaguely from the Rotary Club Maggie used to drag me to, set bond at $50,000 and a mandatory no-contact order with Vanessa Bishop, pending further proceedings. I stood in that courtroom in the same clothes I'd been arrested in, because nobody had thought to bring me a change, and I felt every eye in that gallery on the back of my neck. There's a particular kind of shame in being looked at by strangers who've already decided what kind of man you are before you've said a single word in your own defense. I've felt embarrassed plenty of times in my life. I'd never felt anything quite like that. Denise got me released on bond 2 days later, pending a preliminary hearing. Going back to that house on Yellow Springs Road, knowing Brad and Vanessa were still living in the guest house behind it, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But Denise had told me to act normal. Don't confront them, don't search anything, just observe and let her build the case. I've been a lot of things in my life. I was never much of an actor, but I gave it my best shot. The shop's main security system ran through a DVR unit I kept in a locked closet off the front office. 8 cameras covering the floor, the loading dock, the parking lot, and yes, the basement stairwell. I went to check the footage from the morning of the incident the day I got back, and that's when I found it. The unit in the closet wasn't the one I'd installed. Different brand, different cable routing. I'd scratched my initials into the base of my original unit years ago, a habit left over from watching tools walk off a job site, a habit that had, it turned out, finally paid for itself. Those initials were gone. This was a replacement, installed sometime in the last few months, and whatever it had recorded that morning had already been wiped clean. Somebody had swapped my security system before they ever brought Vanessa down those stairs. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't recent panic. That was planning. I called Denise that night. She was quiet for a moment, then she said the words that turned this from a family tragedy into something else entirely. Walt, she said, when somebody plans around a camera 3 months in advance, that's not a man defending himself from a father he thinks is dangerous. That's a man clearing evidence before he commits a crime. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I drove across the street to see Ruth Callahan. Ruth had lived across from our shop's employee parking lot for 22 years, in the little brick house with the wraparound porch, ever since her husband passed and she downsized from their farm outside town. She'd been a postal clerk for 30 years before she retired, and she noticed everything. She always had. Maggie used to bring her tomatoes from the garden every August, and the two of them would sit on that porch for hours. Ruth opened her door before I'd finished knocking. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said. "Your wife asked me to keep an eye on things a long time before any of this started. You'd better come in." Ruth's living room was exactly what you'd picture from a retired postal clerk who'd spent 30 years paying close attention to detail. Neat shelves, a porch camera app open on an old tablet on her side table, and a spiral notebook full of dates in careful handwriting. "Your wife came to see me about 2 years before she passed," Ruth said, settling into her chair with a cup of coffee she didn't offer to share, which told me she meant business. "She said she had a feeling about your son's marriage, nothing she could prove, just a feeling. She asked me to keep notes if I noticed anything unusual, comings and goings, that sort of thing. She said, and I remember this exactly, Walt will try to fix it himself before it needs fixing, and he'll make a mess of it. I need someone watching who isn't so close to it." That sounded exactly like Maggie. It also broke something loose in my chest that I hadn't expected. Ruth turned to a page in her notebook. "Your son started coming and going at odd hours back in the fall, 11, sometimes midnight. Not always through the front door. About 4 months ago, I watched him carry a piece of electronic equipment out to his car around 11 at night and drive off. I didn't know what it was. I wrote it down anyway. The swapped DVR. 4 months ago. Right in line with when the steel supplier changed. Right in line with when Vanessa started asking about the shop's land value. "There's more," Ruth said, and reached for a second folded paper tucked in the back of the notebook. "I have a friend who does title searches downtown. I asked her a few weeks back when things started feeling like they were speeding up to look into your son's finances. There's a lien filed against a property near Indian Lake. The balance owed is close to $2 million, and the payment's due." She checked the date. "In 10 days. 10 days. The number landed on me like something physical. I'd known about the debt for 8 months. I hadn't known the deadline was already down to 10 days. "He's desperate," I said quietly. "Desperate men make mistakes," Ruth said. "Which is why I've got 2 years of doorbell footage, Walt. Continuous. I should have brought it to you sooner. I'm sorry I made you wait this long." She handed me a small flash drive. I sat in her living room and thought about Maggie, sick and running out of time, somehow finding the presence of mind to build a safety net 2 years before any of this ever showed a crack in the surface. She hadn't known the specifics. She'd known her son, and she'd known that something in him had started wanting things more than he wanted to be a good man about getting them. That evening, I finally did the other thing Maggie had left for me. tucked in the back of our home safe behind a folder of insurance papers I hadn't touched since she died. An envelope with my name on it, in her looping, unhurried handwriting. I'd found it 4 months after the funeral and hadn't been able to make myself open it. I opened it that night. Walt, if you're reading this, something has already gone wrong, and I'm sorry I'm not there to help you fix it. I don't have proof of anything. I just have a feeling I couldn't shake about Bradley these last few years, and about Vanessa's brother, and about how much they both seem to need things they haven't earned. I made sure years ago that the shop's land and our accounts are held in a trust that only you can act on. Nobody can transfer any of it without your signature, no matter what paperwork gets put in front of a judge. If it ever comes to that, and I pray it doesn't, call a young man named Sam Petrosky. You probably don't remember the name the way I do. You will when I tell you where he came from. I love you. I'm sorry I can't be there to watch you win. Maggie. Sam Petrosky. It took me a full minute standing in that kitchen before the name connected to a face. A scrawny 15-year-old boy I'd hired to sweep floors after his father, one of my machinists, died in a forklift accident on our loading dock in 2009. I remember that morning better than I want to. Dale Petrosky had worked for me for 6 years, a steady, quiet man who never called in sick. A pallet shifted wrong on a wet dock in November, and he was gone before the ambulance ever got there. I drove out to his house that same afternoon, sat at his kitchen table with his wife and his son, and I didn't have a single good word to offer either of them, because there wasn't one. I just told them the shop would take care of what it could. Sam was 15 that year, angry at the whole world in the particular way a boy gets angry when the world takes something from him that it had no right to take. I hired him to sweep floors that summer, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with all that anger except give it somewhere quiet to go. He was good at it, meticulous, almost obsessive about it. Like sweeping a floor clean was the one thing in his life he could still control completely. When it came time for community college, his mother couldn't cover it on her own, not with everything else Dale's death had left unsettled. I paid for 2 years out of my own pocket, quietly, through Deb, so nobody ever had to feel like it was charity. I paid for that boy's community college out of my own pocket for 2 years, quietly, because his mother couldn't, and because it felt like the only decent thing to do. I hadn't spoken to Sam in almost a decade. Maggie had. Apparently, she'd written to him 2 years ago and told him who he really was to this family. He'd written back. I called the number Maggie had written under his name at 8 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Bishop," he said, and his voice had the particular steadiness of a man who'd been waiting for this call for 2 years. "I've been expecting to hear from you. I'm a forensic accountant now, out of Columbus. Tell me everything." Sam Petrosky drove up from Columbus that same afternoon and met me at Denise's office on Fountain Avenue. He'd grown into a careful, precise man, but I could still see the 15-year-old in the way he held himself. A little too still, like he was waiting for someone to tell him he didn't belong in the room. "Your wife changed my life, Mr. Bishop," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. "I owe this family more than I can ever pay back. Let's start. Between Ruth's flash drive, the swapped DVR, and the balloon payment paperwork I'd stumbled onto 8 months earlier, Sam went to work the way I imagine a surgeon goes to work. Quiet, methodical, no wasted motion. Within 2 days, he traced something none of us had known to look for. A series of payments from Brad's personal account to a small concierge medical practice in Dayton, made over the last 4 months, that had never once resulted in an actual office visit from me. "They're building a paper trail," Sam explained, sliding a printout across Denise's conference table. "Payments to a physician's office, Time to suggest ongoing evaluation of your cognitive state. There's a draft letter here. Never signed, thank God. We caught it before it went anywhere. From that same office, describing you as showing early signs of confusion and impaired judgment. Denise picked up the draft and read it twice before setting it down. That's not incidental, she said. That's the medical basis for a guardianship petition. Combine that with an assault charge, and a judge grants Brad emergency conservatorship over your affairs inside of 2 weeks. Once that happens, he doesn't need your signature on anything. He can sign for you. I sat in that conference room and finally understood the whole shape of it. The assault charge wasn't the goal. It was leverage, a way to make me look unstable, dangerous, someone the court needed to protect people from. Combined with a fabricated medical record, it built a case that I wasn't fit to run my own affairs, so that somebody else could sell my land to cover a debt I'd never agreed to and never even known about until 8 months ago. The balloon payment's due in 9 days now, Sam said. If they can get emergency guardianship before then, they can authorize an emergency sale of the shop's real estate to cover it. There's already interest from a logistics developer, given the highway interchange upgrade. I found the inquiry in Brad's email. It's dated back in January. January. He'd been planning this since before Maggie's first anniversary. Denise leaned back in her chair. I have to be straight with you, Walt. What we have right now is strong circumstantial evidence, the DVR swap, the medical payments, Ruth's notes on the timeline. It is not yet direct proof that Vanessa staged that fall or that Brad knew about it in advance. A prosecutor could still make the guardianship case work if we don't close that gap. So what do we do? I asked. You go home, Denise said, and when Brad comes to you, because he will, the clock's ticking on him too now. You don't refuse him. You tell him you'll think about it. I want to be honest with you. Everything in me wanted to walk into that guest house and lay every piece of this out on the kitchen table in front of my son and ask him to look me in the eye. But I had spent 40 years running a shop on patience and precision, and I made myself remember that a panicked man with 9 days and $2 million on the line does not behave predictably. A man who believes he's already won does. He waits. He gets comfortable. And comfortable men make mistakes. Brad came to the house that night, alone, and sat in what used to be Maggie's chair in our living room, without asking whether that was all right. Dad, he said, in a voice that had dropped all pretense of a worried son. We need to talk about the timeline. There's a guardianship hearing coming. Given everything that's happened, I want you to know, if we handle this right, quietly, cooperatively, it doesn't have to be ugly. You could keep living in this house. You just need someone managing things day to day for your own protection. And if I sign what you're asking me to sign, I said, keeping my voice as tired and worn down as I could make it, what happens to the charges against me? Vanessa's willing to reconsider her statement, Brad said. If things go smoothly. I looked at my son sitting in his mother's chair, offering to make an assault charge disappear in exchange for control over everything his mother and I had spent 40 years building, and something in my chest ached in a way that wasn't entirely anger, and wasn't entirely grief, but both together. Tangled up so tight, I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Let me think about it, I said. Give me a few days. Brad studied me for a long moment, looking for the trap, the way he used to look for the catch in a blueprint when he was learning to read them. He didn't find one. He nodded, satisfied, and told me the paperwork would be ready by the end of the week. I walked him to the door. I watched his taillights disappear down Yellow Springs Road. Then I stood in front of Maggie's photograph on the living room wall. The one from the ribbon cutting, tin snips in hand, laughing so hard she had to lean on my arm. And I talked to her, the way I always did when the house felt too quiet. "I need this to work, Maggie," I said. "I need a few more days, that's all." For 4 days, I did something I still don't fully recognize in myself when I look back on it. I played the part of a tired old man who'd run out of fight. I said good morning to Brad in the shop parking lot and meant nothing by it. I let Vanessa ask about my blood pressure with a straight face. I moved through my own life like a man already halfway out the door of it. It was the hardest acting I've ever done, and I've had to do a fair amount of acting in 40 years of dealing with customers who thought they knew more about tolerances than the man cutting their parts. On the 3rd day, Sam called with something that changed everything. "The loading dock camera," he said. "The one facing the parking lot. Do you remember installing anything separate from the main DVR system?" I did remember, once he asked. 2 years before the DVR even went in, back when we'd had a run of catalytic converter thefts off customer vehicles in the lot, I'd put in a standalone camera that ran through its own cellular connection and backed up straight to a cloud account under my own email address, completely separate from the main system, because at the time I didn't trust any one piece of equipment to be the only copy of anything. Old habit, from 40 years of things breaking at the worst possible moment. Brad had never known that second camera existed. Why would he? It predated him taking over the books by a decade. Sam accessed the account with credentials I still had memorized. Maggie used to insist we never write passwords down, and for the first time since she died, I was profoundly grateful for her stubbornness about it. What he found wasn't the morning of the incident itself. The camera's angle didn't reach the basement stairwell, but it reached the parking lot and the back door that led down to it. The footage was from the night before the fall, 11:40 at night. Brad's car, parked at the edge of the lot. Brad and Vanessa walking from the car toward the back entrance, and then, for reasons neither of them could have anticipated, standing directly under that camera for almost 4 minutes while Brad worked the lock on a door he technically had a key to, but had no real reason to be using at that hour. The camera had no audio, but Sam ran the footage through an enhancement service that cleaned up the compression, and what came through, faint but unmistakable in the frame, was Vanessa walking down 3 concrete steps by the light of Brad's phone flashlight, practicing. Twice. Both times, on the 3rd step, she let her foot slip in the exact same spot and caught herself on the rail, and both times, Brad said something to her that made her nod and try it again. You couldn't hear the words. You didn't need to. Nobody practices falling down a staircase at midnight for any reason except one. Sam paired that footage with something else he'd found buried in Brad's financial records, a wire transfer from Brad's account to Curtis Voss 2 days after the arrest. Memo line simply reading advance on sale, dated a full 8 days before any guardianship hearing had even been scheduled. Brad had been so confident the plan would work that he'd already started spending money he didn't have yet. "There's one more thing," Sam said, and something in his voice made me sit up straighter. "The concierge medical practice. I called them directly, identified myself as part of the defense's forensic review. They confirmed you were never examined, not once. The payments were for what they called a file preparation consultation, paperwork built entirely from a description Brad gave them over the phone. No examination, no basis in fact, just a story. I sat in Denise's conference room with all of it laid out in front of me. The practiced fall, the premature spending, the fabricated medical file. And I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite rage, but had the weight of both. "We have enough," Denise said quietly. "Detective Alvarez needs to see this before the preliminary hearing. And Walt, I think it's time you stopped thinking about it and told your son yes." Sam's evidence was strong, but Denise wanted one more thing nailed down before we walked into that conference room: the injury itself. Vanessa's medical records from the emergency room visit the morning of the fall had been part of the discovery Denise received as part of my defense, and she asked an old friend of mine to take a look at them. Dr. Patricia Sonnenberg had been an orthopedic surgeon at Springfield Regional for almost 30 years, and long before that, back in the 80s, she'd been a young resident who used to bring her car into my shop for anything her husband couldn't fix himself. We'd stayed friendly the way people do in a small city, a wave at the grocery store, a Christmas card most years. "I'm not going to pretend I can testify about the criminal case," she told me, and Denise, over coffee at her kitchen table, the medical file spread out between us. "But I can tell you what these images show and what they don't." She pointed to the bruising pattern documented on Vanessa's hip and forearm. A fall down concrete steps, especially a tumble of any real distance, produces what we call a distributed impact pattern, multiple points of contact, usually some abrasion from the concrete texture itself, often bruising that doesn't line up cleanly because the body's rotating as it falls. What I'm looking at here is a single, contained bruise on the hip, consistent with controlled contact against a padded or cushioned surface, and there's no abrasion at all, none. If she went down 14 concrete steps, the way she described to the officer, I'd expect to see scraping on at least one elbow or forearm. There isn't any. "So the injury doesn't match the story," Denise said. "The injury," Patricia said, "matches someone who sat down carefully, or lowered themselves onto something soft and then reported the story afterward. I can't tell a jury she staged it. I can tell them under oath that this bruising pattern is not consistent with an uncontrolled fall down a concrete stairwell of that length. That's a meaningful gap for a prosecutor to have to explain." I sat at that kitchen table and thought about the parking lot footage. Vanessa practicing on 3 steps under a phone flashlight, catching herself the same way twice. It had never been a real fall, not once. Every part of it, from the first slip to the emergency room bruise, had been staged with the same care I'd have put into setting up a machine for a tight tolerance job. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, "for looking at this, for not asking why." She reached over and squeezed my hand, the way you do with someone you've known through more than one hard season of their life. "Maggie would have wanted somebody looking out for you the way she looked out for everybody else, Walt. I'm just glad I could be useful." I called Brad the next morning and told him I'd made up my mind. I said yes. I want you to understand what that word cost me. 40 years of building something with my own hands, and I told my son I was ready to hand it over to a court-appointed arrangement built on a lie, because Denise had explained to me exactly why it mattered that Brad believed he'd already won. "A desperate man makes mistakes," she told me. "A man who thinks the fight is over just waits for the paperwork. Give him that. It buys us the time we need to finish building the case properly, and it keeps you safe in the meantime, because a son who thinks he's about to inherit everything has no reason left to escalate." So I played the part. I told Brad I understood his financial troubles better than he thought. I didn't say how much better, and that I didn't want to fight him in court over something a good lawyer could probably win for me anyway, at the cost of both of us, bleeding money and time we didn't have. I told him I just wanted this to be over quietly, for the sake of what was left of our family. He believed every word of it. That's the part that still sits heaviest with me, even now. 40 years, and my own son couldn't tell the difference between his father giving up and his father closing in. Brad scheduled what he called a resolution meeting for 4 days later himself, Vanessa, their attorney, Denise, and me at the shop's conference room, The same room where I'd once interviewed every machinist I ever hired. He wanted it there specifically, he told me, because it would feel less adversarial than a courthouse. I understood exactly why he wanted it there. It was the room where he'd feel most like he already owned the place. 2 days before that meeting, Denise called me and Sam into her office to walk through the whole case one more time, start to finish, looking for any gap Roger Aldrich might try to exploit. "The medical file is solid," Sam said, laying out his documents across Denise's conference table with the same careful precision he probably once used sweeping our shop floor. "The parking lot footage is solid. The wire transfer to Curtis is solid. The only piece I'd still call soft is the injury itself. A good defense attorney could argue Vanessa genuinely got hurt during a real disagreement, separate from the practice footage, and that the wire transfer to Curtis was unrelated business." Denise tapped her pen against the table. "Then we need something that ties the injury itself directly to the staging. Walt, do you know anyone who could look at her medical records with a clinical eye? Someone who could tell us whether the injury pattern actually matches a fall down 14 concrete steps?" I thought about it for exactly as long as it took me to picture the woman's face. "I might," I said. "Give me a day." Denise called Detective Maria Alvarez the day after that meeting was scheduled and walked her through everything: the swap DVR, Ruth's 2 years of doorbell footage, the fabricated medical file, the parking lot footage of Vanessa practicing her fall under Brad's phone light. Alvarez had been the lead on my arrest. To her credit, when Denise laid it all out, she didn't get defensive about her own case falling apart. She got quiet, and then she got focused. "If this holds up," Alvarez said, "I'm going to want to be in that room." Those 4 days were the longest of my life. I went to the shop every morning and walked the floor the way I always had, said good morning to Ronnie and Deb and the apprentices, and none of them knew what was coming. I sat across the dinner table from a version of my future I'd chosen to accept out loud, while quietly refusing it in every way that mattered. I looked at Maggie's photograph more in those 4 days than I had in the 18 months since she died, and every time, I said the same thing to her. "Almost there, Maggie. Just a little longer." The conference room at Bishop Precision Machine still smelled like the coffee Deb brewed every morning at 6. And through the window I could see the shop floor where I'd spent 40 years of my life. Machines humming the way they'd hummed since before Brad was born. It felt strange to sit down at that table as anything other than the man who owned every square inch of it. Brad and Vanessa came in together, dressed like people attending something formal. Their attorney, a compact man named Roger Aldrich who specialized in family estate matters, followed with a leather folder under his arm and the easy confidence of a man who believed he was walking into a formality. Vanessa still had a soft brace on her wrist, a detail I noticed and said nothing about. Denise sat beside me. On the other side of the room, quietly, near the door, stood Detective Alvarez in plain clothes, introduced to the room only as an observer from the department, here at the family's request for a clean resolution. Nobody questioned it. Nobody had reason to yet. Roger Aldrich opened with the kind of language lawyers use when they think they've already won. "We're here in good faith," he said, "to finalize an arrangement that protects everyone's interests. Mr. Bishop has indicated he understands the benefits of a cooperative guardianship structure, and Mrs. Bishop is prepared to formally withdraw her statement regarding the incident at the shop once the arrangement is executed." "Thank you, Roger," Denise said pleasantly. "Before we discuss terms, I'd like to walk through some information that's come to light." She opened her laptop. The first thing she put on the screen was the timeline of the steel supplier switch, the 4% overpayment, and the connection to Curtis Voss. Brad's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. That alone could still be explained away as a family favor. Then came the balloon payment notice. $1,850,000, due now in 5 days. Roger Aldrich's pen stopped moving. "Mr. Aldrich," Denise said, not unkindly, "I'd ask you to consider whether you were made aware of this financial pressure when you agreed to represent your clients in this matter." Aldrich's jaw worked for a second before he answered. "I was told there were family financial concerns, not the specifics." "There rarely are in these arrangements," Denise said, and turned back to her screen. Brad shifted in his chair. I watched him do the math in real time, the same way I'd watched him work out a feed rate problem at 16, trying to figure out how much of this he could still talk his way around. I recognized the look. I'd seen it on his face over report cards, over a dented fender, over 100 smaller reckonings across 38 years. This one, I could tell, was different. This one, he couldn't find the angle on. "Walt," Roger Aldrich said, turning to me directly, his voice gone careful, "I want to be clear that my clients came to this meeting in good faith, looking for a fair—" "There's more, Mr. Aldrich," Denise said, and clicked to the next slide before he could finish. "Then the payments to the concierge medical practice and the confirmation, in writing, that no examination of me had ever taken place." Vanessa's face went the color of old paper.
Then Denise played the parking lot footage. The room went silent in a way I felt in my chest before I understood it in my head. The particular silence of people watching a story collapse in real time. Vanessa, lit by a phone flashlight, walking down 3 concrete steps, slipping on the 3rd one, catching herself on the rail, doing it again and again. "There's no audio," Denise said calmly. "But I don't think anyone in this room needs audio to understand what they're looking at." Vanessa's hand, the one in the brace, gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. And then Brad did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He turned to his wife, the woman he'd asked to fall down a flight of stairs so he could take his own father's company away from him, and in a voice stripped of every ounce of composure he'd carried into that room, he said, "This was her idea. I told her we needed to be careful. I never told her to actually get hurt." The sound Vanessa made wasn't crying. It was something that happens before crying, a small, punctured exhale. The sound of a person realizing that the man she'd built a crime with considered her entirely expendable the moment it stopped being convenient.
Before Alvarez moved in, she looked at Vanessa directly. "Mrs. Bishop, I'd like to ask you something, and you're free not to answer without your attorney present. Dr. Sonnenberg reviewed your emergency room imaging. She's prepared to testify that the bruising pattern documented that morning is not consistent with an uncontrolled fall down 14 concrete steps. Is there anything you'd like to say about that before this goes any further?" Vanessa's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out.
"I want my attorney,"
she finally managed, her voice gone thin and reedy, nothing like the composed woman who'd walked into that room 20 minutes earlier. "That's your right," Alvarez said, not unkindly, and turned back toward Brad. Detective Alvarez stepped forward from the door. "Bradley Bishop," she said, "I'm going to need you to stand up." Roger Aldrich started to object, something about proper procedure and prior notice, and Alvarez told him, without raising her voice, that conspiracy to commit fraud and filing a false police report didn't require an appointment. She read Brad his rights in the same room where I'd once taught him to read a blueprint. Vanessa's own attorney had to be called separately. She was taken in on a second set of charges within the hour: fabrication of evidence and filing a false report of her own. As they walked Brad past me toward the door, he stopped, just for a second, and looked at me with an expression that had nothing left in it but the wreckage of a plan he'd been so sure of. "Dad," he said, "I looked at my son the way you look at someone you already grieved before the ending, because you saw it coming and you did the grieving early, so you'd have nothing left to spend when the moment actually arrived. I loved you the whole time, Bradley," I said quietly. "I want you to know that." Then I looked away, and I let them lead him out of the building he grew up sweeping the floors of. The weeks after that meeting moved slower than any weeks I can remember, and faster somehow at the same time. The charges against me were dismissed within 9 days, dropped by the prosecutor's office once Alvarez submitted her full report, including the parking lot footage, the swapped DVR, and a signed statement from the concierge medical practice confirming they'd never examined me. Denise told me afterward that in 22 years of practice, she'd rarely seen a case fall apart that completely, that fast. Brad was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, filing a false police report, and elder financial exploitation. That last charge stinging in a way I hadn't expected. Hearing my own name attached to a crime meant to protect people like me from people like my son. Vanessa faced her own set of charges for the fabricated fall and the false statement to police. Curtis Voss, it turned out, had been the one who found the buyer for the shop's land in the first place, working an angle with a logistics developer months before any of this became public. He was charged separately in a case that's still working its way through the county court as I tell you this. Brad eventually took a plea deal, 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 3, in exchange for cooperating fully against Curtis and providing testimony about the timeline of the guardianship scheme. Vanessa took a separate deal for a shorter sentence, given it was, by the prosecutor's own account, Brad who'd orchestrated the plan and pressured her into playing her part. I sat in the back of the courtroom for both sentencing hearings, the way I imagine any father would, feeling nothing simple at all, not vindication exactly, not sorrow exactly, just the heavy, complicated weight of watching a life you helped build come apart in a room full of strangers with clipboards. I won't pretend there was anything satisfying about watching my son's mugshot appear in the Springfield News-Sun. There's no part of a father that feels triumphant seeing that. What I felt, mostly, was tired. Tired in the particular way you feel after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Detective Alvarez came to see me on a Thursday out of uniform, a few weeks after the arrests. I put handcuffs on an innocent man because I followed a procedure instead of asking enough questions. She told me, "I'm not going to pretend that's all right. I am sorry, genuinely, for how that morning went." "You believed the evidence in front of you," I said. "That's what the job asks of you." "I don't hold it against you, Detective." She looked at me for a long moment, the way people look at you when they're deciding whether you mean what you're saying. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Bishop," she said, and shook my hand before she left. "Ruth Callahan and I have coffee on her porch most Sunday mornings now. She tells me things about Maggie I never knew. Small conversations, quiet worries Maggie carried across that street 2 years before she died, hoping she was wrong about her own son and building a safety net in case she wasn't. Ruth told me once that Maggie spent her whole life the way she taught second grade, quietly, patiently, planting things that wouldn't bloom until long after she was gone from the room. She spent her whole life building things that lasted. Ruth said to me one Sunday over coffee gone lukewarm in the autumn air, "You're one of them, Walt." I sat with that for a long while after she said it. 3 months after the arrests, I did something Denise had suggested to me the very first week, back before we knew any of what we now know. She told me I should think hard about what I actually wanted the shop to become, once all of this was settled. Not what protected it from a court case, but what honored what it had actually been for 40 years. So I worked with Sam Petrosky, who, by the way, has become something like a second son to me these past few months, in the quietest and most unexpected way a person can become family. And together we restructured Bishop Precision Machine Company into an employee ownership trust. Every one of my 22 employees, from Deb in the front office to Ronnie on the floor, to the 2 apprentices we hired back in January, now holds a real stake in the company they helped build. I still come in most days. I still walk the floor at 6 in the morning. But the shop doesn't belong to one family's fortunes anymore, hostage to one desperate man's debt. It belongs to the people who actually show up and do the work, the way it always should have. We renamed it too. It's the Margaret Bishop Precision Machine Company now. There's a new sign out front, and inside, right by the front office where everybody walks past it every single morning, there's still that same photograph. Maggie, cutting a ribbon with a pair of tin snips because we couldn't find real scissors, laughing so hard she had to lean on my arm. I sold 2 of the 4 acres near the highway interchange myself, at a fair market price, to a logistics company that's been perfectly professional about the whole thing. No guardianship required, no forged medical file. Just a fair deal between 2 parties who both walked away satisfied. The proceeds went straight into the employee trust. Brad's debt was never mine to solve, and I made my peace with that a long time ago now. I think about that morning on the shop floor often. The cold metal of the handcuffs, the way sound seemed to travel too clearly through a room gone suddenly still. My son leaning in close enough that only I could hear him say, "I should have just signed." I think about how certain he looked, walking me toward that patrol car, like the outcome of my whole life had already been decided before I ever knew there was a fight happening. He had no idea what I'd already set in motion. He had no idea that 18 months before his mother ever got sick, she'd started quietly building something meant to outlast whatever storm might come for this family. A trust nobody could break. A letter nobody could forge. A young man she'd written to years before any of us knew we'd need him. And a neighbor across the street with a notebook full of dates and a porch camera that never stopped watching. 6 months after the arrests, a letter arrived at the house from the Clark County Jail. In handwriting I recognized instantly, even shakier than it used to be. Brad wrote that he was sorry, not for getting caught, he said, but for the 4 minutes it had taken Vanessa to walk down those 3 practice steps while he stood there with his phone light on, and never once, in all those months of planning, let himself think about what it would actually feel like to watch his father in handcuffs. I haven't written back yet. I don't know if I will. Denise tells me that's all right, that forgiveness, if it ever comes, doesn't owe anybody a deadline. Ruth tells me Maggie would understand either way, whatever I decide, because Maggie always believed people could tell the truth about themselves eventually, even if it took losing everything first to get there. I think about that letter most Sundays, on Ruth's porch, coffee gone lukewarm, and I still don't have an answer. Some chapters, I've learned, don't close as neatly as we want them to. That's all right too. Not everything has to. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this: silence is not the same as peace. For years I mistook enduring things for being at peace with them. I let small warning signs go unaddressed because I told myself that was what a patient father did. But patience without limits isn't a virtue. It's just delay. A good father isn't a man without boundaries. He's a man who finally learns where his boundaries actually are and holds them, even when it costs him something he loves. Don't wait until you're standing on your own shop floor in handcuffs to start paying attention to what's happening in your own home. Don't mistake someone's need for your signature on a piece of paper for love. And don't ever assume that the people who are gone stopped fighting for you the moment they left the room. Sometimes the people who love us best are the ones still won't press. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about your own family, your own boundaries, the things you've maybe let slide for too long, I'd be grateful if you left a comment and told me about it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of channel where stories like this one keep coming, week after week. There's more where this came from, and I'd love to have you along for the next one. One last thing before I let you go. Some of what you heard tonight blends real experience with details changed or combined for the sake of the telling. If that's not the kind of storytelling you came here for, I understand completely. There's no hard feelings, and I hope you find exactly what you're looking for somewhere else. But if it spoke to you the way I hope it did, thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know.